Welcome to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do. Well, we're way in our 30-somethings episode. And with me here is Michael Thiessen. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. And I'm here with Alex, who's got an interesting backdrop this week. 10,000 subscriber special around this time. So you may have already seen it on his channel. But yeah, congrats on that, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, like in a year and I don't know, a month and something, I didn't expect to grow that fast. I'm very happy that more important than the number, then like people enjoy the content, be it the podcast here, of course, the YouTube channel, a blog post if I post once a year or something. So really happy to see that. And I'm super curious if anyone out there for the podcast, but also for the channel has some ideas like, hey, what should we talk about? I've seen like people commenting, hey, more like enterprise and Vue topics maybe, or can we talk about linting or is that? Just drop it in the comments, send it to us on Blue Sky, on Twitter, wherever you are at, right? I mean, nowadays every web dev moved over to Blue Sky, it seems, so get an account there and write us. And yeah, 10K. Looking forward to that. The special for it will come out in the future, just because, didn't have that much time to prepare it yet, but we record a few things, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, you've been busy with conferences and flying around and all of that. So
yes, but I'm so happy to just be home for a little bit. I'm looking forward to like live stream here and there. Is also something I really would like to do more, just because I'm traveling for like, as I said, workshops and conferences. It's sometimes really tricky, especially like having a consistent schedule is not really possible. With like videos and a podcast, it's a bit easier. You can record beforehand and all that. So yeah, but I mean, that's fine. Sometimes you should do things asynchronously, like fetching your data, right?
Yeah.
Which is the topic of this week's episode of DejaVue: data fetching in Vue.js and also Nuxt.js.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and so we're going to cover how that works. The client side more focused with Vue, and then introducing that server side bit with Nuxt. Obviously, you can do server side with just Vue, but we're kind of split it out in that way because it's kind of a nice organization.
Exactly.
So data fetching, that's like one of the main things that we do in applications is fetch data, and it has a big impact on performance because the network is usually the bottleneck for whatever we're doing, and it can get really complicated when you've got a big app that has one component in one spot is fetching data in one way, and then some other components fetching other kind of data and wants different piece of data, and like organizing that all. We have a whole state management piece that goes along with that, but then just like the network calls and everything, and how do we cache that data? Should we cache that data? All of that, it's a whole lot of stuff to figure out and to think about.
Yeah, also like think about should I fetch the same data twice? Should I reuse it? How to reuse it, right? The caching part there as well. And as we managed like state management, waterfall, so like can I fetch data in parallel or does data A have to wait in data B? And yeah, that's all complex. And as you also mentioned in our performance episode, like, and as you just said, Michael, the framework is rarely the bottleneck. It's often just your API calls, which take way longer than your framework rendering, I don't know, a list of 1,000 entries, which you probably shouldn't do anyway in most cases. But yeah, that's the case. So I'm curious what we'll see here. I mean, we all did data fetching our applications so far. I think there is almost no application out there that doesn't fetch data, be it even from things like local storage or just like state from somewhere, but especially from APIs, be it third party or own APIs.
Yeah, exactly. And so to get started, we've got basically like two ways of dealing with caching. And so the first one is that the browser has some native caching of your HTTP requests based on like different headings and things like that. And so you've seen this with images and other resources that get fetched. If it's the same thing, the browser automatically handles that, and we get the status code back, and we can make sure that we're not going to fetch that data multiple times if it hasn't changed. And so that's the most basic layer. And we don't really think about that because we don't need to, and that's really great. The other layer is, I only use this sometimes, but I'm wondering if I should maybe implement this more, is that there's this like the session and local storage where you have like a bit more explicit control over saving things to the browser itself. And so, different apps like, I don't know, like drawing apps and other things like that, they often do local storage first. Maybe they don't even, there are some apps that don't even save anything to a database and it's all locally stored. And I think that's a really interesting pattern. I don't know if we want to go on that tangent of like, local first versus saving it to a database somewhere in the cloud. But yeah, that's another level of caching that we've got.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, with HTTP headers, just as long as the server is sending the right headers, then we don't have to do anything as front-end people consuming the API. But of course, if it's not the case, or if it's a third-party API, or if we just say like, okay, we get some random content and we just want to store that and don't want to refetch it, then we of course can save it in memory. But then if you refresh the page, it's gone. So local and session storage is the way to go there. But maybe we can even go one step back and think about, okay, data fetching in very simple terms, like what does it entail? Like, how do we do that actually? And I mean, luckily, Vue as a framework doesn't provide a fetching library. And now it's maybe weird to say luckily, because like, oh yeah, why isn't that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you have the freedom to use whatever fetching library you want to use, right? We have the native fetch API, which is in the browser. That's nowadays like a modern way to use. Probably not vanilla. I mean, you can do that, but then you have to handle, oh, is the response okay? Still have like try catch. You have to maybe convert it to JSON and so on and so on. You can use something like useFetch, or also in Nuxt.js, it's auto imported as $fetch, or any other fetch API wrapper like KY, for example. And that's basically just the fetch API with a tiny bit of overhead, usually like smaller than a KB or so. And that will simply work by giving you some tiny helper methods that make your code easier to read, that will make your code also a bit more elegant, because you don't have to do all these low-level checks. For example, automatically throw in an error when the response is not okay. You might wonder, oh, why is it not in the fetch API specs? But there are good reasons for that, though. These wrappers and helpers allow you to just do that straight away. And of course, in the past, people have used Axios, which is also fine, but I wouldn't recommend it for like newer projects, of course, or the good old XML HTTP request, right? Back in times where we didn't have anything else, or like the jQuery abstraction around it. So if you want to use anything like that, or even a server state management library like TanStack, for example, you can do that. Like, you're not forced, as in other frameworks like Angular, to use the HTTP client there because that's the way to go. You can freely choose. And I think that's quite important. Okay, and coming from fetching libraries, let's talk a bit more about async state and Vue and how to deal with that. And there's an experimental feature which is pretty popular and hopefully will be stabilized soon, Michael. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, and in Vue, we've got this Suspense set of features, which I haven't actually like dug into for a while. I did write like this in-depth article on it a few years ago. And it's funny because it's like one of those things where if I'm Googling for something, how does Suspense work? Then I'm probably going to end up back on that article and be like, wow, at one point I knew this, but now I've kind of gotten rusty because I've been, more focused with Nuxt, and Nuxt kind of handles that under the hood for you. But the basic idea is that components, you don't want them to render, or you don't always want them to render until they've got all the data that they need. And so if you put an await inside of your script setup and you return that, basically returning a promise from this setup function, then you can have it set up so that your Vue app won't render that component until it's actually ready to be rendered. Because otherwise what happens is you get this, data is undefined kind of thing where you're waiting for that data to populate, but it's not yet. So you have to check with flags or something like that to see, oh, is this data there? Oh, it's not there. Okay, then I'm in a loading state, so let me show the loading spinner. But with Suspense, it sort of handles that all for you. You have your main component, and while that's being that data is being fetched and the promise is still going, you have it fall back onto your loading state, whether you have a spinner or a skeleton or something else like that.
Yeah, and it could be a whole component, right? You can just provide as like a loading, even an error component there if you want to for the fallback, which is pretty nice. But like, I think Suspense is really great, as you said, if you have some like heavy async operation that you need to do before rendering the component. But I also think in a lot of cases, Suspense is not necessarily needed and can be also very tricky. So for example, if you just have like a call in your component to say, okay, I want to render some data I received from an API, and that's can be like way after the component is mounted, then we start with, okay, how's the best way to abstract that? And well, one easy way is just use Vue uses useFetch. Here we go again, the good old Vue use recommendation. Or build your own composable to say, okay, I have a ref. That value is initially something like null. And then whenever the data is fetched, then you just set the ref to the newly value. Ideally, that ref can also be a shallow ref, because if you only use it for data fetching, well, it's a good use case. We also talked about it in the past. But then whenever something happens to that ref, you can react to it. You can watch it. You can render things with VIF based on that ref. And then, for example, pass on the data in a new component that's only rendered when the data is actually there. So in a lot of cases, you might not even need Suspense at all. Plus data loaders, which are a kind of new thing in the Vue router unplugin, and it's also developed and they're kind of stable by now. Made by Eduardo. They also don't use Suspense at all because it has some limitations. So keep in mind that Suspense is a great way of dealing with async state, but also just a regular composable might be even easier.
Yeah, and we talked about the data loaders and how that works with Eduardo a few episodes back, I think episode 31, but that's going to be in the show notes if you want to take a look at that. It's pretty interesting stuff, and I think it's going to solve a lot of issues that people have with data fetching. One opinion that I have, which I'm very willing to be challenged on, but with Suspense, is that it's more of those like architecture level kind of things where you probably will set it up in like a layout or something like that, and it's less something that you'd be dealing with day to day, like in each feature that you're working on. It should be something that's more like you shouldn't have to worry about it. If you set it up in your Vue application, you shouldn't have to worry about it as you're building out new features. It's just sort of like, just like with error handling and like things like that, it's just sort of like, if you have a full page error or something like that, it kind of bubbles up, and then there's the thing that you set up 6 months ago that handles it. And so if you do use Suspense, it's maybe not something that you have to think about or worry about constantly.
Yeah, at least if it comes to like, okay, as I said, you have like your Suspense around like the component that the Vue router is rendering, or as I said before with Nuxt, it's just out of the box there. That's true. Then just set it up once and you're good. Though you can also use Suspense for like more fine-grained situation if you want to have, let's say, you have 5 different widgets on the screen and you don't want a loading state for all of them separately, but you want a loading state until they're all there because they all have information that belongs together, let's say, or just like, I don't know, 2 components, and you don't want to show the lower one first and then the one that's fetching the data, but just wrap a Suspense around both and say, okay, whenever both async components are finished, then show them both together, and otherwise show a loading state. So sometimes this can also be really nice to avoid the cluttering on the screen of like, oh, there pops something up and there, but just like everything nicely resolving together and is a bit more, let's say, coherent in terms of appearance. While of course that means longer loading times for the user, but sometimes the perceived performance can even be better there.
Yeah, good point. Keep things organized instead of having a billion spinners everywhere.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, then from that part, I mean, async state is super important. So like with all the different ways to solve that, we all talked about caching a little bit. We come slowly into terms of performance. And there has been a lot in terms of third-party scripts. So not even fetching data, but loading third-party scripts, which in a way is also fetching data, but differently, right? And them being not on the main thread, but in, let's say, a web worker. So, for example, there's something like Partytown that you can use to run all these things on the site, not blocking the main thread. Then that means having still a UI that's usable and also better LCP. And also Daniel Rowe from the Nuxt team worked on Nuxt workers, which basically allows you to use web workers for any kind of thing, but usually like heavy operations while just having your main thread clean and simple. Let's say, I don't know, image manipulation or whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, service workers web workers are something I haven't really dug into a whole lot, and it's such a useful feature. And we've got things like mock service worker for testing and that kind of thing that take advantage of this in a very seamless, like nice way. If I was doing an image editing app, you got to put that in don't want to block the UI to do all of that kind of stuff or any other sort of heavy lifting. I'm sure there's a lot of different use cases for it that are out there.
Yeah, especially as you said, like the heavy operations. And a good example is Squoosh.app. Some might know it, also linked in the show notes. So like where you just have like your image editing in the browser to like compress and minify JPEGs, SVGs and whatnot. And you can do that easily. There's no freezing. You can always use the app interactively, and there's some heavy work done in a worker to make sure everything is still smooth and interactive. So yeah, that's definitely useful if you have that kind of case. And if you're more concerned, of course, about performance of your third-party scripts, then Partytown is an option, or also Nuxt scripts, though they both do very different things in terms of performance. Partytown with the web workers, Nuxt scripts by just saying, hey, let's load the script at a later point of view, or like just at a later time point, and we just have a proxy in place to make sure if you, I don't know, collect some data beforehand, you can do that, and then we just replay everything that the proxy has as soon as the script is loaded and do lots of other things, whatever you basically want to do.
Yeah, and as an aside, it's really fascinating to see all the different apps that are being built with all the different in-browser stuff that people are doing, like photo editing and video editing and games and things like that. And we're getting it's really interesting to see the web platform getting closer and closer to native, and it's like the difference between what can be done on native versus what can't be done on native is getting really small. That's a topic for a whole other podcast, though.
Yeah, also like WASM, for example, is like it's amazing to see that you can play Doom in browser and stuff, just like compiled with WASM. So yeah, let's see where it brings us. But as you said, it could be a nice extra episode. If you're interested in that, drop us a comment and let us know, right? So we'll get someone on who has a lot of WASM experience and see how that goes.
Yeah, so the next part is with Nuxt. And so Nuxt has a few extra things to deal with when it comes to data fetching, because we're dealing with server-side rendering that then gets hydrated into a client-side app. So it's a bit more complicated. And what we've got to do is first deal with the data fetching side of things. And so the most important one here is to fetch data with the built-in methods, composables that come with Nuxt. So we've got useAsyncData, we've got useFetch, and we've got the lazy versions of those. We also have $fetch that Alex mentioned before, which is the uFetch that gets auto-imported for you. And so uFetch is being used under the hood here for the data stuff. And these handle the hydration life cycle for you, so that on the server, it'll fetch the data, and then it'll just pass that along to the client, and we don't have to fetch it on the server. And then once that gets to your browser, refetch that again, because obviously that's extra work and we don't want to do that. And so, yeah, these things sort of, they handle that for you. Then with server-side rendering, we also have this issue of cross-state request pollution. I always forget the exact wording. I think I got it right.
Yeah, that's correct.
the one of those jargony terms, where basically if you've got data fetching happening on your server, well, if 10 people come to your site at the same time and those requests are being processed simultaneously, we don't want someone else's data ending up in your request or vice versa. And so we have to do special things to make sure that we isolate every single request, which
exactly
doesn't happen by default. And so you don't want to have that to happen. And so yeah, these composables will handle that for you, as well as the whole hydration thing. And so you can get that, and you don't even have to know that this is happening. You maybe are using these already and don't realize that that's what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, mostly just works, which is the great thing, right? That's why I also use a framework. Just to add on there, it's obviously correct. Like useAsyncData and useFetch, they will save you from the cross state request pollution. They will save you from hydration errors because they fetch on the server. If you have your initial request, like loading a site from, I don't know, coming from Google or like hard reloading, then that's happening. On the server side, data is passed over and then reused. We also have a whole episode on the server-side rendering part as well. $fetch is very important. There is a difference between the use things like useFetch, useAsyncData, and $fetch. While $fetch is something you can use, I don't know, everywhere in your backend, like in Nitro, even in your Express app if you want to by just using ofetch, or in your legacy Node.js application. You don't need a Vue and Nuxt context for that. While the composables are, of course, something that only runs in there, which also means the composables, and there are also simple rules for that, right? You should only use them in your setup function or in another composable. While the $fetch, of course, you can use in, let's say, a function that's a handler for an @click event, perfectly fine. But it's like one of the most common mistakes I've seen, and that's also why I made a video about that, like how I call it, you're using useFetch wrong, and then like in parentheses, I hope you don't. I think it's my most or second popular video so far on the channel. Because a lot of people, they are not aware of the difference, because if you call a composable accidentally, like in a click handler, it could lead to memory leaks. It could use, like, because you use refs usually with composables, it could lead to like accidentally sending a request on every button push. So that's all a bit tricky if you're not aware of that. So definitely worth checking it out, and not misusing composables in general in your Vue application or also in the Nuxt application.
Yeah, the general rule is sort of that composables are for setting things up on the when that component initially gets loaded, and then they're just supposed to react to things. And so if you have that composable in the click handler, you're going to reset up that data fetch every single time it gets clicked, and so then that causes issues.
Exactly, and it can't be cleaned up. That's the other thing, right? Like it's not easy.
Right.
Like usually, if you call it in setup, then the component is being unmounted, is being destroyed. Like okay, goodbye. But if it's in a click handler, it's like, yeah, when will this ever end? It won't. It will be a memory leak until, like, besides the functionality, right? That's maybe accidentally doing weird things like submitting a fetch request all the time when you just enter your password per letter. Yeah, you don't want all of that, but that's the way to solve that there. But yeah, data fetching Nuxt is, I would say it's very similar to how you do it in Vue, as long as it's with like form submissions and things. And Michael, as you said, when you have like things that you want to have on the server side as well, so also in your HTML, then you use the composables. You can even use them when you don't want that by just saying like server false, and then you just have these. But usually they're there to say like, okay, as you mentioned, they're reactive. So I set it up and say I want to fetch data from that URL based on these parameters. And when they change, please refetch data with that new body to make sure, I don't know, I click on a filter button, it adds like a query parameter in the URL, and then things will be refetched because these change. So that all works very, very seamlessly with useFetch and useAsyncData.
One interesting thing I'd like to point out about the $fetch is that it's got this neat trick where it knows if it's being called on the server. And so instead of, if you call a route that's in your app, instead of doing the whole, HTTP request to do a post to this endpoint, which then calls the event handler, well, it's all part of the same Nuxt app, so it can just call that event handler directly and just entirely bypass that whole HTTP layer. And then, of course, when you're in the browser on the client, it knows that, and so then it, of course, makes that full request because the server's not running locally in your browser, and so it's got this like neat little optimization, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's thanks to Nitro, the server engine, where just, as you said, says, oh, that's part of me anyway. I'll just run the actual event handler function with the event that's already happening, and then we're good. Absolutely. It's very good in terms of performance. So you get bonus out of the box without doing anything, which is always great.
Yeah. So Then we come to caching in Nuxt. And I believe that you have a whole video that you did on this. So maybe you want to take this one.
Sure. Yeah, I have multiple, I think, because there are like different caching layers from like caching on the let's start with caching the client, caching on the server to have like these parts separate. And caching on the client, well, all the things that we talked about before on the client side, they apply as well, right? Like make sure your server is returning the right HTTP headers to just say like, okay, we have the data ready, it's all fine. That's all valid. But there's one more thing, especially with random data, that you can do and make sure there's no actual call again with useFetch and useAsyncData. And what you can do is use a low-level function called getCachedData. And in there, you can basically say, oh, if there is data already and you can read it out, then return the data. And if you return null or undefined right now, I think Nuxt for it's only null and undefined is treated as a valid answer, then the data will be refetched because we'll just say like, okay, fine, there is no data, I'll run it again. Now that we talk about it, there's also one of some error cases where, oh, there is my API endpoint and it returns null or undefined. And then useAsyncData is rerun everywhere because, well, oh, the data is not there while it is. So don't do that. But yeah, that's something that will also be improved because right now the code is very low level. You can even like set a TTL to say like, okay, I want to have that in memory cache for like, I don't know, 30 seconds or whatnot, and then refetch it. That all works. But we plan on having some kind of composable utils for that. So you can just write, I don't know, cache colon and then TTL cache 1000 or something like that, or similar things. So the code is not duplicate, it's not at low level. You know by using that composable utility that, okay, I use that type of caching. Lots of ways to plug in, but yeah, that's work in progress. There's an open issue for that, and let's see when it will happen. But it's definitely neat if you want to have, especially caching client side. It works for SPAs built with Nuxt. While all the server benefits, of course, are only there when you have an actual server. Otherwise, yeah, cache data is a good threat in all cases.
Yeah, and that's a parameter that you pass as an option to the fetch composable.
Yeah, to use fetch or use useAsyncData, both support that, correct? Because also there, as a note, useAsyncData is more or less this. If you use useAsyncData, just to have a little bit about the difference between useAsyncData and useFetch, you can choose your fetching library. So you can use Axios there, you can use $fetch and whatnot. And useFetch is more or less a more elaborate version of useAsyncData with $fetch together. So if you use them together anyway, then useFetch is doing a little bit more on top of that and like watching certain things. Also, there's a big video about what's the difference there, but it's maybe just good to know if you wonder, oh, should I use the one or the other? And the answer is depends. If you use $fetch anyway, then just use useFetch and you're good. If you want to do a few more things, like low level useAsyncData is the way.
Yeah, useAsyncData gets any async function. It just needs a promise.
Exactly. You can even just like do return promise.resolve if you want to. But yeah, that's of course not that helpful unless for testing. And yeah, then on the server side, we have a lot of things that we can do thanks to Nitro, so thanks to the server engine. So we have, let's start with routeRules because they apply to the whole application. So in Nuxt, you can basically say, okay, this path should be just pre-rendered, right? Or this path should be cached until the next deploy, or this path should be incrementally generated statically, or this path should be cached and then the cache should be renewed without the user noticing. So SWR, style by validate behavior, and so on and so on. And you can do that for your Nuxt pages, but also for your API endpoints if you write them with Nitro or wrap them. There is one thing why I personally don't do that much with the Nuxt pages themselves is because you can easily introduce, let's say, a different result between caching that initial request, because it's only the server-side rendered page, right? So if you refresh the page, then the cache will be hit. But if you then navigate to another page and back, well, that API response has to come from somewhere as well, right? So if you don't cache your API responses as well, and only the server on that side, you might get newer data when you navigate, and then when you refresh, it's still the old data. So that's a bit tricky. So you either have to invalidate the cache nicely when the API response changes, or cache your API responses too, which I would recommend for sure. And then if we come to your API endpoints in your application, so basically whatever you write in with Nitro and E3, You have a few more options. You can also use the routeRules for that, but then for caching, you can use defineEventHandler, and you can use defineCachedEventHandler to pass in all the things you can pass in the routeRules, but even a bit more, like what's the cache key name? How should I cache that? Like with which storage should I cache that? You can also do it in the routeRules. Say like, okay, this page should be cached in my Redis or on Cloudflare KV or Vercel whatsoever, Upstash, I don't know. Really up to you, MongoDB.
And that gives you more control than the routeRules does, right?
It does give you, to some degree, yes, for example, for the naming, mainly because in the Nuxt config and also Nitro config, because it also just works on plain Nitro, the config always has to be serializable, so you can't pass in a function or classes or whatnot. So if you have like a get key function or should invalidate cache or should bypass cache, you can't define it in the config. The problem with that is that only works for, as I just said, like your API routes and not for Nuxt pages that you cache. We still have an open issue for that to have a more fine-grained control to say like, okay, hey, before you render all that, let's do something like make sure this is cached, return a cached entry, whatnot, to make sure that's actually possible. But it's also work in progress once again. But yeah, with these defineCachedEventHandler, you can all do that. And then you have something called defineCachedFunction. So if you say, I only want to cache a part of my event handler or like a reusable utility, which is very common because sometimes you have like, oh, this user is authenticated. You don't want to cache the whole request, but maybe he's requesting some, let's say, GitHub repositories that he starred. Then you can just say, okay, I want to request the repositories as key. I use the user ID, so I have a cache based on that key and the path. Or the user just request whatever a public resource, and you can just cache that then, and that's cached for all users. You can use defineCachedFunction. Works the same way as the event handler, but it's only for a smaller part of that. And once again, you have full control over that. And it's really, really useful, especially for that like fine-grained caching when you still want to have all your requests actually coming in. So one common example is you want to log user activity. Then you can say like, okay, I want to cache everything that's happening in the request, but the request should still happen. And in the end, there's just like a log function called even after the request was responded to. So even after the response is sent, then like just log that little part and then you're good.
So this caching is done through Unstorage, I'm guessing?
Yes, correct. So Unstorage is used for that.
Yeah, so that's what gives you this configurability of store it in Redis, store it in memory, store it,
correct,
wherever, because you can have whatever kind of storage thing you want with Unstorage. Yeah.
Yes, and that's really smooth. It works very well, and of course you can use Unstorage also to store arbitrary data. I recently had like a little application I built for one of my clients where I just stored some plain information in the file system with Unstorage, which is super useful, especially for a little demo backend, and even like whole videos you can store with that. So it's really versatile.
Yeah, and on one of our first episodes we did with Harlan, where we talked about how he built this SaaS app in a week with Nuxt. He used Vercel's key value storage to basically store all the analytics for the application. So instead of hooking up a database and doing all that kind of stuff, it's just like 1 or 2 lines of code to just say set, and then you pass in the value, and then a get call as well. It's
really
simple.
Really smooth.
It's all you need.
Exactly. Also there, check it out, episode number 2, I think it was, with Harlan, because 1 was the need for SSR, and 3 was, I think, even Nitro. So like jump all the way back after the episode and take a listen, because it's super interesting. It was a great journey, an experience there. So worth checking that out.
Yeah.
And in the end, there are quite some ways of caching, and people might wonder, how do I need like all of these layers? Because there is a lot. The answer is you probably don't. Like, it depends really what you want to do. I would always suggest, if you use SSR anyway, then like set up your API endpoints and cache them as aggressively as your data allows to do, just because, why not saving up some time for that? Like, why let the user wait if you already know the answer to the result? And with all the free tiers out there for KV stores, or even just do it in memory, that only doesn't work if you have like, I don't know, workers, because then memory is just one instance, so that's tricky. So like, yeah, just do that. And then I think on the client side, there's a lot of caching benefits to data. Also, once again, where you know, okay, this takes long to fetch, and maybe the API is not under your control, so you can't say the headers right. So it's also sometimes worth to cache it there. But as usual, I would suggest to find the let's say the hot parts of your application, or like just the very slow parts, and optimize these first. Because if it's like, I don't know, a 30 milliseconds request or like a 25 one, it doesn't really matter if it takes 5 seconds or, I don't know, 200. It's a bigger difference. So yeah, really check what slows your application down, and then see how you can improve that and cache that. Maybe even for like a backend for front end, if you have like an API you can't change, wrap it, take the data, transform it, store it, and build your own little backend for that API. And yeah, that usually works pretty well.
I have a question for you about useNuxtData. So we've got this composable. It lets us access the data that useState and these fetching composables, useFetch, useAsyncData, that they're using for these caching that we talked about this. How would you use useNuxtData? Like, would you use it for caching at all, or like how does that fit into this picture with caching and all that?
Yeah, we haven't even talked much about useNuxtData yet, but as you said, yeah, you can access all the data that's already, let's say, there because it was fetched. You need a key for that. I probably wouldn't think about caching as the first use case. I think more common is something like optimistic UI updates, where you say like, okay, I have the data and I do a call, and I change something in the data already before having a return value, just to have the user, like, let's just assume things go through, right? We're good. Show the user a nice, I don't know, +1 on your vote count, and then you're fine, and then actually process the real response as soon as it comes in. So it's once again also about having the user perceive the app is fast, and if it doesn't work, roll back and say like, oh wait, everything broke, sorry. But I don't think necessarily for caching. Maybe for reusing data, that of course can be used too, to say like, okay, I use it on a different spot. But then you could probably also use a useFetch or useAsyncData with immediate false, so it doesn't trigger straight away when you call it. But that depends a lot on the use case. So it can be used to some degree for caching, especially a bit similar, like get cache data in some cases. But I think I never reached for that in that context.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, the useAsyncData, like, or yeah, with the immediate false, and then you get the is it an execute command, or was that API recently
changed? Execute and refresh, and both do the same, and just just the same naming for like different contexts. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what confused me. Refresh, execute. Well, I guess the first time you should call execute, and then if you've already called it, then switch to refresh.
I mean, it doesn't matter much. It's literally the same function. I'm even right now thinking about just creating an issue to say like, do we need both, or can't we just rename it on the spot if you really need different context? But
yeah,
it's more of the semantics of say like, okay, I just call it once whenever the function is like ready, then I just call it execute because it hasn't been executed before, or do something like, oh, when I push that button, actually refresh the data. But yeah,
I think that makes sense, because if it's the first time you've called it, refresh is confusing. But so and especially naming things.
Naming things is hard if you don't take a look at the code and you don't know that these things are the same. Yeah, maybe I think it should also be noted in the JS doc somewhere. But who reads the docs usually? Yeah, so it might be something to sneak in as a Nuxt for change. But on the other hand, I mean, it's easy to refactor with a code. I'll think about it. I will also probably just ask the other team members what their stance on that is very soon. So maybe when that episode is out, there is already a 4.x issue about that.
It is confusing to have the same thing named differently, because you assume if there's two different things that they do different things.
Exactly. I mean, you can rename it depending on the situation, right? So nothing stops you from, in that case, name it execute. In that case, just like destructure it and name it refresh.
Yeah. Yeah. There's probably a more generic term that you could use, like fetch or run or something that's like.
Yeah, that's true.
But who knows?
Yeah, also introducing these changes, I probably just would scrap one of these that's like less popular, because then if you introduce a third one, it's like migration is just, it's a bit of a pain. But yeah, it's definitely something maybe also to ask the community about how they feel about it, if that was confusing to them. It's definitely something that I will take to the team and discuss. But yeah, in the end, for Nuxt, that's more or less what caching is there. Of course, there are like some more in-depth, as I said before, like videos on how to use these things, how to build stuff. And yeah, I mentioned Nuxt scripts as well, which is also like not for your data fetching, but for the third-party scripts there, and super useful. Image, of course, as well, Nuxt image, fonts, like all the core packages, so to say, really worth checking these out.
It's interesting that like there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to Nuxt and data fetching and caching, because Nuxt gives you more tools to work with. And that's like the point of these meta frameworks, is that, yeah, Vue gives us a bunch of stuff to work with. In terms of data fetching, it doesn't do anything really, which is the way it should be. But then Nuxt comes along and adds on all these extra things to make our lives better. And clearly both of us are on the Nuxt train, and we aren't getting off anytime soon. So
that's true. That's true. I also think the other part is that Nuxt adds a little bit of complexity as well, as in like server-side rendering is great, adds more complexity. So if you don't need that, just turn it off. It's also totally fine. Or like you can even turn it off with a routeRule. So like, hey, my admin dashboard doesn't need that, which is totally true. But performance-wise, SSR can be really beneficial, because then you can actually do these things like, cache stuff, get all the API calls together, and then send out the data and cache them. So instead of in an SPA, you have no choice other than, hey, I call these APIs, I can transform things on the client, but I need to load all the data. So that's always a bit of an issue. Then you might start like, okay, I can build my own API to do that. So you have a different API service and an SPA, and in a way that's also fine. But then still you have to do that API call. And then it starts with performance once again, with like, okay, the user sees a long loading spinner. That's not ideal. And so on and so on. So I think SSR has its merits, but surely not every application needs it.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, that there are trade-offs, right? And so
100%.
You introduce complexity, then you need extra stuff to handle that complexity.
But I'm very happy that, with Nuxt, you can just start building a plain Vue application without technically any feature that you want, right? Like you can say, okay, I use my own router options file. I set up my own routes. I ignore everything around it. So like migrating a Vue application, what finally Daniel did on the stream recently, also linked to that somewhere there. There are your show notes. And for everyone listening, I point down on your phone's description. You know what I mean? So that's definitely something to take a look at, because people are also like, oh yeah, all this complexity, all these features, is it really worth moving over? And it's difficult, and depending on your application and what you want to use, but like moving over and having still an SPA is not that tricky. Then of course enabling SSR, changing things, it might be a bit more, but even that is possible.
Yeah, and one last thing I'd like to add is that sometimes it can feel like Nuxt has so much stuff, and you think, oh, I only want to use a few features. Why would I use this big, heavy framework that's going to include all this stuff that I don't actually need? But Nuxt actually just only adds in the stuff you need. And so if you don't need a router, then it won't include the router. And if you don't need, some sort of functionality, it's not going to include that in there for you. And like tree shaking things and, getting that bundle size really small, that's one of the things that Nuxt does really well. And so you can just like add in features as you need them, and Nuxt will just like happily put that in there for you, and you don't have to worry as much about bundle size.
100%. If we come back to data fetching and that, if you have a plain SPA, you can just use $fetch in your own composable for that. You don't need to migrate to useFetch and useAsyncData, because okay, all fine, it's good. But if you then consider using SSR at some point, of course, it's helpful to have that. And they also provide some DX ergonomies that are really nice. So it's worth checking them out. But if you said, okay, I have a code base that's working, then you're good, right? That's once again the beauty of choice. to say like, okay, these features, I don't need them or don't want them now, or I just don't have time to implement them. Same for like migration and stuff. So yeah, that's great.
I think that brings us to the end of this episode then.
Absolutely. We could probably also touch on like REST APIs and GraphQL and everything, but I think that's also a bit of beyond the Vue scope. Maybe GraphQL with Vue could be very interesting for a future episode. But yeah, that's once again could be another podcast episode besides the WASM one we talked about.
I have a lot of flashbacks to GraphQL and Vue. So
good or bad flashbacks?
Bad ones. So maybe I'll skip that episode, or maybe I should be there. It'll be a good,
like have a healthy discussion.
Yes. Yeah, it'd be therapeutic
Absolutely.
for me to talk it out.
Yeah, let's make that happen. Get someone on who's using GraphQL locally, because I also don't really, but I know quite a few people who might do in you too. So also, once again, if you're interested out there, write us, let us know. And of course, check out the other episodes. We mentioned so many. The link on the show notes, or just start from one and listen through all of them again. Check out Michael's website, and stay tuned for next episode every Thursday afternoon in European time, and Thursday/Friday morning everywhere else. So yeah, go for it.
All right. We'll see you in the next episode.